it's a great pleasure, in a sense, to be here and be part of one of Sir Thomas Gresham's great legacy projects. The kind of legacy projects that had his wife, Lady Anne, sadly shaking her head at various points. I mean, certainly once Sir Thomas Gresham died in 1579. The first project was the Royal Exchange. It lasted, by my calculation, 1 century and about 3 months before it was destroyed by the Great Fire in September 1666. And I want to end right at the very end with a rather dramatic quotation, a narrative of that moment of destruction. But I better tell you about the building before we get to the end. This isn't it. I thought I'd begin with a trick slide just to see who's paying attention at this point in the early evening. This is Antwerp, the Antwerp Bourse, the new exchange in Antwerp. And in a sense, if we want to understand the Royal Exchange, and I think if we want to understand London in the 16th century and that kind of extraordinary growth of the city, certainly in terms of its population, in terms of its built space, but very definitely in terms of its kind of mercantile heft and clout, we need to begin with what, before London, was the leading financial centre, the commercial powerhouse of northwestern Europe in its day. Antwerp was a fantastic city, made rich by precious metals from southern Germany, by English cloth. This is where English merchants went to trade their cloth in the great Antwerp fairs, and it was a great entrepot for northern Europe. The place where merchants went to buy their art and their fine goods, coming all the way in across the Mediterranean from as far as Asia along the Silk Road. So Antwerp is really our starting point in so many ways. And I've always loved a description from the late 16th century of life in the new Bourse, the new exchange in Antwerp. A confused sound of all languages was heard there, and one saw a party-coloured medley of all possible styles of dress. In short, a small world wherein all parts of the great world were united. And that sort of captures the essence and the power and the vibrancy of the Antwerp Bourse. And I think it's that power and vibrancy that Thomas Gresham, by the 1560s, wanted to bring to London. This is a lecture, in a sense, about one building in London, but in many ways it's a European story, a story of emulation in so many ways. Early Tudor London had no equivalent to this building, to the Bourse. There was no purpose-built space where London merchants could conduct their business. Well, London merchants and foreign merchants, those conducting business in the streets, and they literally were doing it in the streets, on Lombard Street, in the wind and the rain and the snow, in all weathers, no cover at all. The other great financial centre of early Tudor London was St Paul's Cathedral. And that's where, by long tradition and practice, early modern Londoners went to settle their debts. Debts were paid at the font stone in Paul's Church. St Paul's Cathedral, of course, a stone's throw to the south just from here. So we're very close, in a sense, to those two financial, in different ways, but financial centres of early modern, early Tudor London. St Paul's Cathedral, a stone's throw, and Lombard Street, a different stone's throw in a slightly different eastern direction, but still not very far away. There's a sense that Londoners wanted their city to have a little bit more bit more clout than that in financial terms. There was an aspiration, I think a building aspiration, on the part of the city corporation and certain very well-heeled merchants from the 1530s. And of course these merchants spent very much most of their time in Antwerp. That's where their businesses were based. So it's a city with which they were familiar. Back to St Paul's, because St Paul's sort of comes in and out of focus, I think, in this story a little bit over the next few minutes. St Paul's is important in a sense because of worship, because of religion, also because of money, but it's a social space as well, a place where Londoners met, talked, promenaded, begged, and also read books and bought books. The great booksellers of Tudor London generally had their shops and their stalls around Paul's churchyard, and also the sermon place of London, Paul's Cross. The first efforts to build an exchange for London, in a sense to kind of replicate what Antwerp was able to provide for the merchants of Northern Europe, was actually the project of Sir Richard Gresham, Sir Thomas Gresham's father. In a sense, there is a kind of Gresham story and a Gresham continuity to this. And that was when Sir Richard Gresham, who in his own right was an extraordinarily successful mercer and moneylender, was Lord Mayor in 1538, and he presented to Henry VIII's great minister, Thomas Cromwell, plans drawn out to make what he called a goodly bourse in Lombard Street for merchants to repair unto. And he estimated to Thomas Cromwell in 1538 that he supposed it will cost £2,000 or more for the honour, every penny worth it, for the honour of the king. But for whatever reason, that plan came to nothing. But in a sense, the seed was sown. I think it was sown at a relatively kind of early point. It's a seed that, germinates over time, 30 or so years later. The key character, of course, in all of this is Thomas Gresham, Sir Thomas Gresham. And here he is as a young man in his middle 20s, in what I think is a rather extraordinary portrait. It's pretty rare at this point, and we're, in the middle 1540s. It's pretty rare, really, for any merchant in London to have a portrait at all. Later merchants, yes. Early Tudor merchants, no. And even then, it tends to be head and shoulders. They tend to be modest portraits, modest scale. This, I think, is astonishing. It's by, we have to be pretty sure, I think, an Antwerp artist at a time when the young Thomas Gresham, in the later 1540s, early 1550s, was effectively in charge of the Gresham's business operations in the Low Countries, based practically next door to the new bourse in Antwerp. And it is, as I say, an extraordinary portrait for a young man. He's in merchant's black, an extremely expensive colour to dye in the 16th century. It's a modest kind of look, but in fact, it shouts wealth and comfort and riches, and it's full length. This is the style of painting that we would find for a Habsburg prince, and not a young London merchant. So there's just a sense in which even this very young man, now with a lot of responsibility by this point, running really a whole family's operations, his father's business, his uncle's business in Antwerp. You know, a real sense that this young man wanted to make a splash. There's a real sort of ambition to it. From 1551, Gresham was effectively managing also the English crown's considerable debt in and around Antwerp. The great banking houses of Europe in the 16th century, families like the Fugger and the Welser had major offices in Antwerp, and the young-ish Gresham, the 30-something Gresham, spent a lot of his time from the reign of Edward VI managing, massaging crown debt, doing deals in the new bourse, dealing with the financiers, attending to interest rates, and so on. His ambition was to, you know, get that debt down as quickly as possible. He was knighted in 1559. At that point, we have Sir Thomas Gresham, effectively a merchant, but primarily from the 1550s a mercantile diplomat in many ways. In the 1560s, one of Thomas Gresham's factors, his business agents, the tough Richard Clough, wrote to Thomas, this is 1561, that I will not doubt but to make so fair a bourse in London as the great bourse is in Antwerp. It's a very long letter, and at the end of that letter, Clough gets rather kind of excited and frustrated that the city fathers of London, you know, have not pulled their finger out and have, you know, in a sense done what London should be doing, which is aspiring to, you know, sort of position and status in the bigger financial world. And it's Clough who, in a sense, sort of voices that ambition, and who then, as far as we can tell, does absolutely nothing about it at all. But in a sense, it's a kind of continuing germination of an idea that had been, you know, with the Greshams, in the Gresham family for a number of years. The key point, the key date, I'm sure this is something that John Guy will talk about in his lecture. It's the death of Thomas Gresham's heir, son and heir, Richard Gresham, in May 1563. Quite what precisely the relationship was between the death of Richard and the first tangible efforts to bring the Royal Exchange for London about is a little unclear. But there's some meeting, at least, in the 1560s between, you know, what appears to be the direction in which Sir Thomas Gresham's mind is moving, and also a kind of collective will on the part of the Court of Aldermen in the city to make a move in Thomas Gresham's direction, you know, finally to do something about founding a bourse. In January 1564, Gresham made his offer, and the deal was that he would build the bourse, the City of London would find the space and level whatever was there in preparation for the project. And of course the site of Gresham's Exchange is precisely the site of the latest incarnation of the Exchange, as it sits there now just south of Threadneedle Street. Gresham, I think, was seeking to make, at this point, a splash, you know, to show his ambition to establish himself as a great patron and a civic benefactor. And as I said right at the beginning, you know, it's very much, I think, a legacy project, quite consciously from the beginning. And this is Gresham in the 1560s. This is Gresham, probably very much actually at the point of the decision, the first steps and the first stages in the building of the Exchange. He laid himself the first brick on the 7th of June 1566. In November 1567, so just over a year later, the same was covered with slate, and shortly after fully finished. And the words belong to John Stowe, the great antiquary of London. And, so it's a fairly sort of quick building project, really, especially for a huge project, a large building. The design was Gresham's, and it was consciously European, and it looked very specifically to Antwerp. Gresham recruited a Flemish master builder and Flemish bricklayers, and they were brought over to build the exchange, much to the annoyance of London's bricklayers who picketed the site. So that there were difficulties. Some things never change, and big building projects are controversial, especially when you get in foreign labour. Gresham's Exchange became the Royal Exchange, sort of in a formal way, really, in 1571. Business begins in the December of 1568, and then in 1571, a few years later, Elizabeth I visits. She has a great meal, dinner with Gresham in his mansion on Bishopsgate, and then again the description is John Stowe's. Her Majesty, returning through Cornhill, entered the Bourse on the south side, and after that she had viewed every part thereof above the ground, especially the pawn, which was richly furnished with all sorts of the finest wares in the city. She caused the same Bourse by a herald and a trumpet to be proclaimed the Royal Exchange, and so to be called from thenceforth, and not otherwise. Now, the reference to the pawn, which seemed to grab Elizabeth's attention particularly, is something to remember. I'll talk about that in a few minutes' time. So here we have the building itself, and it is, as you can see, rather impressive. This is one view of it. As a description, which I think is rather fine and is better than I could do on my own, quite frankly. 1576, description of the building. It is a quadrangle surrounded by three great walks or galleries, one above the other. The central aisle is where the merchants retire and shelter when it rains. It is 6 or 7 paces wide and paved with black and white blocks of fine work. Around this alley there are 36 great stone columns, each 12 feet high, set 4 paces apart. The heart of the exchange is the quadrangle, large enough to hold 4,000 merchants, aside from the central walk. It is cobbled and is 80 paces long and 60 wide. Here the merchants stroll in fine weather and talk business at the times aforesaid, times that I will explain in a minute or two. High on the facade, in the inner walls, all about the exchange, are 36 columns of jasper marble, set at 10 feet apart, and between them niches in the facade in which to place figures of the kings and queens of England, those who have reigned since William the Conqueror, which are to be of bronze. Above the columns are to be painted flat the arms and names of the king, princes, and lords of those times. I think the tenses there are interesting. You get a sense that there's still, a notion of work in progress here, that the exchange is still, even in the middle 1570s, a bit of a work in progress. Contemporaries who visited it said that it was a little bit smaller, just a little bit smaller than the new Bourse in Antwerp. It had 2 routes in, north and south. The Antwerp Bourse had 4 routes in. But effectively, it's the same kind of space. And as you can hear from that description, it's built on a grand scale, and no expense was spared. You just get a sense from the building materials. Even those building materials that people could see on the outside, that this is a building that was supposed to communicate wealth and power. And to be very much kind of Gresham's stamp on things. Very neat in this image, and they are consistent in all the images we have of the exchange, are the appropriate, of course, for the evening, the Gresham grasshoppers there, just at the top. What I want to talk about in a few minutes' time is the exchange as a place of leisure. But we should talk about it really, think about it initially as a place of business. There were 2 trading hours over the course of the day. And these are the kind of formal trading hours, and I think we can assume that lots of business was done outside these formal hours. But nevertheless, 2-hour-long sessions, one between 11 o'clock in the morning and 12 noon, and then again between 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. Notionally, the exchange, this space, was divided up into nations. English merchants occupied about half of the exchange. The French merchants had their space, Flemish and Walloon merchants, Italian merchants, Spanish merchants, and so on. Although I think these spaces were not fixed, and there was very probably a fair amount of fluid movement around. It was not a stock exchange. I think if we're thinking of stock exchanges, we're thinking a few decades later, we're thinking probably Amsterdam, the trading of shares in the Dutch East India Company. The exchange, in a sense, was the exchange of mercantile business, and it was the business of bills of exchange, the principal means of moving money around mercantile Europe in the middle to later years of the 16th century, drawn up and agreed contracts between individual merchants. So we have not only merchants, but we have the notaries drawing up the bills of exchange, merchants' factors, merchants' agents, posts, couriers coming in with news, which makes the exchange, by the very nature of the business, like the Antwerp Bourse, a place of deals, a place of business, but also a place of movement and of news as well. You know, if you wanted to hear what was going on across Europe, you went to the exchange to keep up with the latest news. It's important, though, to say that the exchange was open to all Londoners. It was open to the elite, the non-merchant elite, gentry, the nobility, who went to shop and promenade. It was certainly open to the poor, who went to beg, and it was open to criminals, who saw opportunities to pick purses and dupe and gull the naive. There's a rather sort of nice account of the exchange in sort of moral terms, really, by an Elizabethan writer called John Payne, writing in 1597. He said that the exchange was a place where God's truth and equity with their direct contraries are sometimes spoken of to God's glory and to the service of Satan, which rather sounds dramatic. And in a sense, the exchange was, something of a stage. And there's at least one late Elizabethan play, William Horton's Englishman for My Money, which uses the setting of the exchange as part of the drama. The play tells the story of Pizarro, a rich Portuguese merchant and usurer who plans to marry his daughters against their wills to 3 wealthy foreigners. The daughters, however, love 3 honest Englishmen who are in Pizarro's usurious clutches. And the Englishmen, you'll be amazed to find out, are able to outwit Pizarro and marry the daughters. The important point here is that the exchange is a setting for at least part of the play. So, we have incidental roles by notaries, couriers, posts, we have news coming in. And one scene, it really actually sort of ends with the ringing of the Exchange bell, which is a rather nice touch. I said a little bit earlier that the Exchange was public place and people went there for pleasure, and I think that's a really important point to emphasise. The Exchange stood for the making of money, but it also stood for the spending of money too. I mentioned the pawn, and it's a word that derived from pand, the kind of arcade or cloister that was used to sell cloth and other goods in the great Antwerp fairs. And it's an interesting other case of kind of transplanting something from Antwerp over to London. And the pawn, the shops of the pawn occupied the upper levels of the Exchange. And one visitor in the middle 1570s estimated that there were about 150 stalls of what he called rich merchandise, most notably all sorts of mercery. It's really sort of fine goods at the very top, but all kinds of specialist items there, haberdashery, mercery, even suits of armour, high-end armour was sold at the Exchange. It's clear that at the Exchange the rich showed off their riches, and it's just as clear too that the poor were in evidence at the Exchange. John Payne, 1597, wrote that the poor passed to and fro through the Exchange, and I think it's a place, again, almost a stage where we see those Elizabethan extremities of wealth and poverty put side by side. We find dubious characters also in the Exchange. Elizabethans, elite Elizabethans, established, moneyed Elizabethans, were terrified of crime and criminality and sensed the existence of a great criminal, organised criminal underworld. And it's clear that criminals preyed on gentlemen at the Exchange. But also spies. There's a very nice example of an Elizabethan spy, well, a putative assassin of the Queen, Anthony Babington, who, you know, there's nothing like doing something in plain sight, decided that he was going to give a grand dinner for his fellow conspirators in the July of 1586. And it's very close to the Exchange at the Castle Tavern next door, because people went to the Exchange to shop and also to eat. It was a place to advertise one's professional credentials, you know, if you had them. One Dr. Langton, a medical attendant to Sir Thomas Gresham, had his testimonial pinned up in the Exchange, torn down by a rival physician in 1573. And fair to say that he wasn't happy, and he got Sir Thomas to write on his behalf. And it was also a place for merchants to, if they needed to, air public grievances. One Clement Draper in 1592, ruined, so he claimed, by the Earl of Huntingdon, and he wrote rather mournfully, "I protested publicly unto my creditors, and spread the same protests upon the Royal Exchange and the gates of the city, to manifest my wrongs and to crave liberty." Poor thing. So in a sense, you know, he goes to the Exchange to plead his case publicly. If the Exchange was a place of meeting and spending and conversation, as much as it was a place of spending money, of making money, it was a place also of print. And there were some interesting examples of I think, sort of forward-thinking, entrepreneurial Elizabethan booksellers who began to open shops in the sort of elite shopping end of the Exchange, at the Pawn. I think the best example here is Thomas Hackett, who sold his books at his shop in the Royal Exchange at the sign of the Green Dragon. and he sold books that had to do with travel and navigation, books that had a sort of mercantile focus. I think the Exchange was never really ever going to rival the kind of book centre of London, which remained Paul's Churchyard, but nevertheless there was a market there, and booksellers like Hackett knew it. One of the books that Hackett sold at his shop in the Exchange in 1601 was the account of the second Dutch voyage out to the East Indies, and of course the Dutch efforts to expand into Asia at the beginning, right at the beginning of the 17th century, were, movements and navigations that English merchants kept a very close eye on indeed. So in a sense, we can say that the Royal Exchange was European, but Europe at the turn of this new century, right at the beginning of the 17th century, was already beginning, in a sense, to look out to the world beyond its own continent, and looking out to the East Indies was very much where it seemed to be at from 1600. Here, in a sense, the story of Exchange can take us in two directions, which sit, for me, in interesting tension. The first is to look out to the world, to use the Exchange as a way of, beginning to kind of plot and map the ambition of London's merchants to get involved in ventures like the Levant Company, which in a sense was foundational for the East India Company. We can plot those points in that sort of direction. I don't think it's an accident, really, that by 1595 there was a floating Royal Exchange, one of the two of the most imposing of the Levant Company's ships, 300 tons, a crew of 70 sailors. So a floating Royal Exchange going to the far ends of the Mediterranean. The Levant Company became, as I say, one of the early foundations of the East India trade. So that sense of kind of looking outwards, the kind of global story with the Exchange is interesting. In tension with it, I think, is the domestic story, which has to do with some of the tussles after the death of Sir Thomas Gresham in some pained negotiations with his widow, Dame Anne, over the upkeep of the Exchange. There's a rather sort of pained letter from Elizabeth's Privy Council in 1581, 2 years after Sir Thomas's death, and the council felt that it was forced to write a polite but firm letter to Dame Anne, just a reminder of her obligations to upkeep the Exchange, the maintaining of that famous building in respect of the memory of her late husband, the executor of the same, and the discharge of the trust committed unto her. The Privy Council in 1581 had detected that one of the buildings, one part of the Exchange had fallen down. Their estimate was that it would take probably about £20 to put it right, and they're having to, slightly, politely, firmly apply the thumbscrews to Dame Anne to cough up the money, which she seemed consistently reluctant to do. The end for the first Royal Exchange came, of course, in the Great Fire of 1666. Again, by my calculation, this is a century and 3 months after Sir Thomas Gresham laid the first brick of it. I'm going to end by reading Thomas Vincent's account of the destruction of the Exchange as the fire raged through Cornhill. The Exchange, I think, had remarkable origins, and it had a remarkable and dramatic end. And it's really the kind of drama, the present tense drama that I love about Vincent's account. So here we go. Now the flames break in upon Cornhill, that large and spacious street and quickly crossed the way by the train of wood that lay in the streets untaken away, which had been pulled down from houses to prevent its spreading. And so they lick the whole street as they go. They mount up to the top of the highest houses, they descend down to the bottom of the lowest vaults and cellars, and march along on both sides of the way with such a roaring noise as never was heard in the city of London. No stately building so great as to resist their fury. The Royal Exchange itself, the glory of the merchants, is now invaded with much violence. And when once the fire was entered, how quickly did it run round the galleries, filling them with flames. Then came downstairs, compasseth the walks, giving forth flaming volleys, and filleth the court with sheets of fire. By and by fall all the kings upon their faces, the statues of the kings of England, and the greatest part of the stone building after them, the founder's statue only remaining, with such a noise as was dreadful and astonishing. Thank you very much.